Now, I want to close by talking about why do we still, 80 years later, because this is the 80th anniversary of the General Conference vote to establish regional conferences. And even though we live in a different time, we no longer live in a society that is as heavily segregated, including churches, including the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We no longer live in a society that is the same as it was 80 years. So there are those who, including some of you, who are saying, why do we still need regional conferences? And so I'd like to answer that question to close out. I want to give you 7 reasons. Here's the first reason. The most important reason is that regional conferences have proven to be the best way to reach people of color with the gospel of Jesus Christ. And regional conferences have done that at a level that has allowed them to grow significantly faster over the last 80 years than the rest of the church in North America. I would also posit to you that even though regional conferences are not solely made up of African Americans. If you come into our building, you will come into what's called the Hall of Nations. And in those nations, in that hallway, and in the room that's adjacent to that hallway, you'll find the flags of almost 90 countries. Those flags represent nations where we have members who originate from those countries in our regional conferences. So regional conferences are diverse. They include a diversity of different cultures, including Caucasians. When I was president of South Central Conference, I had the privilege of hiring the first Caucasian pastor in South Central, and the first Caucasian school teachers, and the first Korean pastor, and hiring and expanding our workforce to include more people from the West Indies and more people of Spanish descent. So our conferences are diverse, but our first responsibility is to reach people of color. That's not the only group of people that we're charged to reach, but that's the first group. Because my question is, if African Americans don't reach African Americans, who will? And so, the first reason why we need regional conferences is because regional conferences have been the best source of reaching people of color. That includes people of Spanish descent, people of West Indian descent. Let me say to you very quickly, as someone whose ministry began in the Caribbean, in the West Indies, in St. Thomas of the United States Virgin Islands. One of the dumbest fights in our church is when people from the Caribbean find themselves juxtaposed against people of African American descent. Because the truth of the matter is, we're all of African American descent. People from the West Indies and people who were born in the United States. We all came from the same place. As I tell my Caribbean brethren, the only difference between you and us, and I'm both you and us, having worked in the Caribbean, having got my start in the Caribbean. If it were not for the North Caribbean Conference, I may not be in ministry. But as I tell my brethren from the Caribbean, the only difference between African Americans and our brethren from the Caribbean is when you all left Africa, you all just got dropped off in better weather. So when I talk about people of color, I'm talking about people of color. as I said earlier, people of Spanish descent, people of Caribbean descent, people of color. Our first, but not only responsibility, but our first responsibility is to reach people of color. Now, let me quickly say, we have a responsibility to reach everybody, including our Caucasian brethren. And let me give you a specific example. Gentrification means that Caucasian people have moved into the inner city where we are, and our responsibility is to reach our neighbors, who now include people who do not look like us. And so we have a responsibility to take the gospel to every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. But I would suggest that responsibility starts with people of color. That's reason number one. Reason number two, regional conferences give us the ability to control. It gives Black people the responsibility to control their own resources. I'm taping this from the studio of the Charles E. Dudley Senior Center for Regional Conference Ministries. That's a building that's 32,000 square feet, 2 stories, $9 million. That's what it costs to build this building. I'm sitting here in a building that's debt-free. And the reason why that building is debt-free is because regional conferences control their own resources. Now, usually when I say that, people say, why did you spend all that money on a building? Simple. If you have ministries, those ministries have to be housed somewhere. If they're housed somewhere, that means you have to pay something. You're either paying for your own building or you're leasing space, which we used to do, which means you're paying somebody else to pay for, you're paying for somebody else's building. Let me give you an example of somebody that did that. The North American Division several years ago built their own building, right? There's some people I'm sure would question, why would they spend money for their own building? Well, because where they were before they had their own building, they were spending $1 million a year in rent. I would suggest to you that it is good stewardship to have your own building rather than pay for somebody else's building. We were leasing space, paying money every year or every month, I forget which one it was, for somebody else's building. We now pay nothing and we have our own building. But the reason why we're able to do that is because regional conferences control their own resources. Those of you who are in regional conferences, it is your faithfulness that allowed us to have our own building with our own studio so that we can tell our own story, all right? So that's reason number two. Reason number three, regional conferences give people of color a seat at the denominational decision-making table. It is very important when decisions are being made that affect you, for you to be at the table to have input in that discussion. So let me give you an example. When I was a conference president, I was a delegate to the General Conference session. If we didn't have regional conferences, then what we'd have to do is we'd have to sit in a union executive committee and kind of wave our hands and say, hey, when you're electing delegates, remember us. We don't have to say that because we have our own entities, which means those entities give us a seat at the denominational decision-making. So we have a voice at the decisions that affect us. Reason number 4, regional conferences are a better economic model. Let me give you an example. Let's look at the very first regional conference, Lake Region Conference, very first one. The vote to start Lake Region was in 1944. That was followed by a vote, within a matter of weeks, a vote to start Northeastern, which was followed shortly thereafter, a vote that started the old Allegheny Conference, which is now Allegheny East and Allegheny West. All right. Now, but let's look at Lake Region. That's our first one. Lake Region covers the states of Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. In that same territory are 5 state conferences: the Illinois Conference, the Michigan Conference, the Indiana Conference, the Wisconsin Conference, and the Minnesota Conference. Okay, same territory. Okay, so each of those conferences has a president. So that means Illinois has a conference, Indiana has a conference, Wisconsin has a conference, Minnesota conference, Wisconsin has a conference president. Okay, so they're paying 5 people to do what Elder Gabriel, the president of Lake Region, does by himself. All right, each of those conferences has their own conference office. All right, so that's 5 conferences. There's 5 state conferences again versus 1 regional conference. Each of those conferences has their own set of departmental directors, like a youth director, an education director, a publishing director. That's 5 of those versus 1 in Lake Region. All right. Each of those conferences has a campground, 5 campgrounds versus 1 campground in Cassopolis, Michigan for Lake Region. Think about it for a minute. It costs literally tens of millions of dollars more to operate those 5 state conferences than it costs to operate Lake Region. Am I saying that we don't need those state conferences? Of course not. Okay. But what I am saying is there are people who say we don't need regional conferences when the fact of the matter is regional conferences cost less but have grown faster, which means regional conferences have done more with less. All right. Reason number 5. I shared this with you already. Regional conferences are one of the great success stories in the history of our church over the past 80 years. They've grown significantly faster, roughly 4 times faster than the rest of the church over the last 80 years. Reason number 6, Black churches are often the only Seventh-day Adventist church inside the city limits of most major cities, right? Our state conferences typically are in the suburbs, but inside the cities, which is where most people live, inside the cities are mostly either regional conferences or state conference churches that have turned Black, right? So regional conferences are the largest force in cities which are where people live. When I say the largest force, I mean the largest Adventist force. All right, and then lastly, we need regional conferences because racism hasn't died, nor is it likely to die.